So let's get on it and let's answer it. We're going to give you 3 possible answers to this objection that there is no evidence for God.
When I saw this title with one of my least favorite objections to Christianity, I thought I might have to spend an episode agreeing with Jay. But it turns out, the good detective managed to respond in ways that make the bad objection seem downright solid. Welcome to Paulogia, where a former Christian takes a look at the claims of Christians. If you're new to the channel, why not take a second to tap on the subscribe button so that you'll be notified when new science, theology, or news videos are posted. It's time once again to visit cold case detective J. Warder Wallace as he tries to equip Christians to have conversations with those who have objections.
Quick shot responses that we have been looking at related to objections that are offered against Christianity or against God's existence, whatever. You might be out someplace, you're not going to have your collection of PDF files. You need to have it on an app so you can just open up your phone while you take a break from the conversation, get the response you need, and get right back in the conversation. That's why we've staged these in the phone app.
If you're someone who's planning to use Wallace's material in conversations, or if someone is using Wallace's material on you, I'd like to offer my insights as to where the conversation can go from there.
The objection is simply that there's no evidence for God's existence.
I frequently hear non-believers say this, and believe it or not, I also think this is a poor objection to Christianity. At least how it's worded. It's hyperbolic, an over-exaggeration. It makes a positive claim that you can't back up. It's fair to say there's insufficient evidence, or that there isn't the kind of evidence that would convince you personally, or even a lack of evidence that points uniquely to the God hypothesis, for example. But even unconvincing evidence can still be evidence. I mean, the fact that people throughout history have believed in gods is in and of itself a form of evidence for God. It alone shouldn't convince anyone, but it's enough to invalidate this no evidence for God claim and make your objection seem obstinate rather than considered. If you actually want to continue a conversation with a believer, you're better off to object that there is insufficient evidence to convince you that there's a God, rather than the blustery, bold, blanket dismissal. It lets you bypass any preamble disputes and defensiveness and dive straight into what the person believes and why.
You might want it to be true, you might have some intuitive experience, but if you're outside of your own experience even, there's really no other evidence for this.
It's funny that even Wallace's hypothetical skeptic follows my advice and qualifies categories of evidence. There's no non-experiential evidence for God is an easier claim to defend than the no evidence one. I expected Wallace to attack the exaggeration of this objection, but instead he's generous to steelman it. But other believers you talk to may not be so kind.
Here's the problem. If all you had was one singular piece of evidence to make a claim, and it happens to be your experience, then all I have to do in order to overcome your single piece of evidence is knock down your experience. And I have an experience of my own, it's different than yours. Therefore, we're done. Trump.
I'm glad he said this. So many believers think that their personal experience should be compelling to others. But unfortunately, experiences aren't transferable in humans.
Well, what do you mean by evidence? You realize now there are 2 forms of evidence, right? I mean, this is the kind of evidence that is used in every criminal trial. It's used to prove anything. There's only 2 forms, direct evidence, and that happens to be simply eyewitness testimony. And there's indirect evidence, and that is everything else.
In this post-CSI world, calling testimony direct evidence and everything else, including fingerprints, DNA, and even security footage, indirect evidence, seems counterintuitive, I know. But the detective is correct in the lingo as used in the court system. So, if you hear Mr. Wallace speak about direct evidence, know that he means testimony, not forensic science.
Now, both those forms of evidence count. They're both used to make cases in criminal law courts. From a Christian perspective, we've got a large body of direct evidence, eyewitness testimony of people who actually observed the resurrection, recorded it, they recorded it in history.
I'm not sure what Wallace considers a large body of eyewitness testimony, and this may surprise some Christians, but we have exactly one and only one, recorded source where the author both identifies himself and claims to have seen resurrected Jesus, the Apostle Paul. That's it. Every other record of Jesus sightings is anonymous or passed down from other people. We don't need to get into the post-ascension, probably not physical nature of Paul's vision, because my point here is that one source cannot be a large body of sources. You don't even need to pluralize sources.
And, we actually have another body of direct evidence because there are people who will tell you that they have had experiences that they attribute to God's interaction. And you might discount those. You might want to try to explain those other ways. But you would have to at least admit that this is a form of evidence And you should take it seriously if you say you are concerned about the evidence for God's existence.
Well, I would probably do my best to take seriously the claim that the person had such an experience. It's actually relatively easy to grant that a person has experiences. In fact, I've had experiences that I once attributed to God's interaction. The real question is, do we need to take seriously their self-diagnosis of causation? How did the person come to determine that the experience was divine, rather than merely circumstances and brain chemistry? By this standard, would Wallace consider experiences attributed to Allah or Vishnu to be evidence of their existence? Or would he wonder if the attribution could be mistaken?
Beyond those two forms, there's a huge body of indirect evidence. Now, that's everything else you can discover by way of science.
Since Wallace is going to briefly blast through a list of points with little in way of support, so too I will try to keep my responses equally brief, knowing that each topic mentioned could be the subject of a series of in-depth videos rather than mere bullet points. As I've already covered some of them, I'll put links to those in the description.
So, for example, we're in a universe that came into existence from nothing. The science tells us that.
Science doesn't tell us that the universe came from nothing. At least not the kind of nothing Wallace proposes. Astrophysicist Lawrence Krauss's famous book, A Universe from Nothing, describes how pre-universe nothing actually included quantum fluctuations and other things. Perhaps energy is eternal, as we might understand it. In general, science makes few claims about the state of things before Big Bang Planck time, if before time is even a coherent concept.
And anything that has a beginning, like a universe, has to have a beginner.
This language is smuggling in agency, where agency is the question. It doesn't make sense to say, every sound has a sounder, or every spin has a spinner. Those are obviously not correct. But that's what Wallace is doing here.
And it turns out this beginner, according to the science, cannot be spatial, temporal, or material.
Science doesn't speak at all about a beginner. Wallace is smuggling in agency again. Whatever the cause for our current instantiation of space-time, it makes sense that it would be outside of our particular space-time. But that says nothing about not being spatial or not being temporal. And I have no idea where this non-material requirement is supposed to come from. Not science.
So we have now an immaterial, non-temporal, non-spatial first cause of the universe.
You don't.
So you're already stepping in my direction here.
I'm not.
This is why we would call this evidence.
It's not compelling evidence, but sure.
We have fine-tuning we see in the universe. I mean, if you found something was fine-tuned, like a guitar, you would assume that there's a fine-tuner.
Smuggling in agency again. Every drift requires a drifter. The argument from fine-tuning is making the mistake of thinking that a puddle determined the shape of the hole, rather than the hole determining the shape of the puddle.
We have the origin of life from inorganic matter, and it's all driven by information in DNA. How do we get information from anything other than intelligence?
Optimized sequences of chemical combinations isn't the same kind of information that you're conflating. The information of life objectively mutates and evolves in observable ways, in exactly the way designed computer programs don't. Those who try to use the information argument neither define it nor use it.
And most of that is best, I mean, I would say that body of evidence, that indirect evidence, is best explained by the existence of a divine creator.
An explanation that isn't falsifiable isn't an explanation at all. Of course, an all-powerful being can be posited to explain anything and everything, whether you call that entity God or Sammy the universe-creating wizard.
Do you think you might be interested in examining all the evidence, both the indirect and the direct evidence, with me that's related to God's existence?
Absolutely. I'm very interested in examining the evidence with you. That's why I'm here.
These are inferences. They're indirect inferences, indirect evidence. And don't let them off the hook. Indirect evidence in a court of law is given the exact same weight as direct evidence.
Possibly even more weight, since the indirect evidence isn't subject to the kind of human perception, bias, and memory problems present in testimony evidence.
So don't let them say things like, there's no hard evidence. There's no such thing as hard evidence for anything. That's not a term. You're making that up. You're watching too much TV.
I mean, all phrases were made up by someone. What matters is if we understand what it means when it's said. Hard evidence may not be a phrase with legal standing, but there's no confusion about what is meant when it is used. Hard evidence refers to something tangible, something that can be touched, a weapon, a hair, a scratched bumper, a signed contract. Of course someone can say there's no hard evidence for God. They're commenting on the availability of physically tangible evidence. It's irrelevant if that's a legally defined category of evidence or not.
I want you to be able and willing to shift the burden of proof. The idea here is that you're making an affirmative claim that God exists, and therefore you alone have the burden of proof. You made the claim. You need to be able to prove that. But the other side that believes there's no God also makes an affirmative claim that they have a burden to prove.
I suppose if someone is insisting there is no God, then that would be an affirmative claim. Far more likely, you're going to be talking to someone who is simply unconvinced that a God exists and is understandably waiting until there's sufficient evidence to make an affirmative call. I would strongly recommend you ask the person's position on this before wasting time trying to flip the burden of proof.
So what I would do if someone asked this question, if you're not comfortable making an affirmative case, then simply shift the burden of proof to where it really goes, because the thing started with somebody saying there's no evidence for God's existence.
And here I agree with Jay. There is no evidence for God is an affirmative claim, and one you'd have to back up. I don't think it can be backed up without qualifiers, so maybe don't make it, and avoid this waste of time as well.
So if God didn't create the universe and everything in it, if there's no evidence for God because there's no God, if that's the case, then everything we see in the universe is simply a product of physics and chemistry, given the ingredients that are available to us, which are just space, time, and matter.
I guess if one is a philosophical naturalist, that would be accurate. Definitely not all non-believers would fall into this camp.
So tell me, what evidence do you have that those features alone, those features, those materials, those forces can produce, say, for example, consciousness?
Consciousness appears to be an emergent property of brain cells, just as wetness is an emergent property of enough water molecules. Damage the brain, and you damage consciousness. The physical aspect of consciousness is undeniable, so it's at least reasonable to assume this is a physical process.
How do we get free choices if all we are in is a purely physical, what's known as a deterministic universe?
Well, if you define free will as the ability to have made a different choice under identical conditions, then neuroscience seems to indicate that we don't have free will. In study after study, our brains have already made our decisions before our consciousness is aware of it. Our decisions are a function of our brain chemistry, our experiences, and the exact environment at the instant of decision.
What evidence do you have, for example, that physics and chemistry can produce the information we have in DNA?
It's funny you should ask, Jay. Earlier this month, this peer-reviewed paper in Science describes a repeatable chemical pathway under which RNA bases emerge from plausible early Earth conditions in massive quantities. This may or may not be the exact pathway that early life took from chemicals to RNA to DNA, but it certainly demonstrates one way it could have happened. Life from inorganic matter is getting less and less mysterious.
What evidence do you have that those forces you were talking about, the purely natural forces, space-time, matter, physics, and chemistry, can account for the appearance of fine-tuning that's both in the universe and even the appearance of design in biology?
In his efforts as a detective, Wallace should know that appearances can be deceiving. The appearance of fine-tuning is not the same as fine-tuning. The appearance of design is not the same as design. We have pattern-seeking brains, and we are prone to infer agency where there may be none.
If evidence is important to you, and it sounds like it is, then how can you support your naturalistic explanations for all these features of the universe when there isn't sufficient evidence to support such claims?
When there's insufficient evidence to form an explanation, the best and honest answer is, I don't know. I wish people of all stripes were more comfortable with I don't know than with false certainty. That said, we all agree that the natural world exists. It is our reality. And at no point in history has a natural explanation been overturned in favor of a supernatural one. It might be unfair to be dogmatic about it, but to expect that new discoveries will continue to be natural is reasonable.
And I see a bunch of evidence in the crime scene, and I'm with a partner, and the partner says to me, oh, this is clearly the husband who did this, based on the 10 pieces of evidence I see in the crime scene. And then my other partner says, no, it's going to be the roommate who did this. I think it's a roommate, and he makes a case for the roommate. Look, both of them have a responsibility to make a case. There's features in the crime scene. If you think it's the husband, make the case. If you think it's the roommate, make the case.
So the detective is correct in saying that each claim must be evaluated on its own merits. And I'm hoping that he's indirectly saying the choice between husband and roommate would be a false dichotomy. It's also possible the husband and roommate were in on it together, or that neither the husband nor the roommate did it. Perhaps the 10 pieces of evidence they have aren't enough to be conclusive, and a conclusion must wait for an 11th or 12th piece of evidence. Since I'm not sure where he's going with this, let me bring this home a little. If we reach the point in human history where we fully understand every aspect of how life emerged from non-life, and how DNA sequences came to be as they are, that wouldn't do anything to disprove a God. All it might potentially demonstrate is that God isn't necessary. At the same time, if the concept of evolution of life from common descent was completely disproven tomorrow, and unanimously thrown out the window by the scientific community, that would do nothing to prove that God exists. As Wallace explains, the God hypothesis would still need to meet its burden of proof. His suggested shift to putting naturalism on trial attempts a false dichotomy that will leave his listeners no further ahead in the conversation.
I think when people realize that they cannot make a case, that they don't have sufficient evidence to even support their own naturalistic views, you have taken a step in the right direction.
So the conversation will land at, I don't fully understand, and neither do you. Okay. And the person with the naturalistic view will at least be able to demonstrate that the natural world exists. So where does that leave us?
People will object to your view as a Christian or as a theist, and they'll say, hey, you've got a God of the gaps attitude, right? You don't have a way to... They think that what we're doing is saying, hey, we can't explain it scientifically, therefore God. Okay, but don't be surprised. The other side has a science of the gaps view. They can't explain it scientifically, therefore it's just space-time, matter, physics, and chemistry.
As discussed, hopefully the person in the conversation will admit that they don't know everything yet. So the answer is, we don't know. But since natural explanations have always overturned supernatural ones, and never the other way around, it's reasonable to expect future answers to continue this way.
If you're going to tell stories, you need to know what the story is. And you need to have enough depth in the story that your 140, 280 character version of it, your Twitter version of the story, if somebody probes in deeper, can actually can actually see the richness of it. So whenever I hear someone tell a story in which they name someone by name, I'm probably going to search that online, right? And learn more. Maybe I want to just know more so I can follow the journey, or I want to fact check the person who's making the claim.
All right, so Wallace is about to tell us a story. And right up front, he's inviting and expecting everyone to get onto Google and check the names and to fact check the details of the story he tells. Don't worry, detective. I've got my Google machine handy. I won't let you down.
I don't know if you knew this or not, but one of the most famous atheists of the last century, certainly probably one of the most famous atheists of the generation in which he lived, was a man named Antony Flew.
Okay. Antony Flew, a noted British philosophy professor at schools like Oxford, passed away in 2010 at age 87, spent most of his life advocating for atheism. He coined the phrase no true Scotsman fallacy. That's a good one. And in 2004, at the age of 81, he seems to have had a change of heart about his atheism. I'm guessing that's where Jay's going here.
And I guess as the years go by since he's passed away, that maybe people don't know much about Antony Flew, and probably as the years progress, they're going to know less and less.
Yeah, I'd heard the name, but didn't know much about him until you prompted me to start researching. In fairness, I was still a Christian when he passed. Are you sure you want this increasingly obscure figure to be the example your followers hold up as the prime figure in conversations? He must be some kind of exceptional, one-of-a-kind, slam-dunk, airtight witness for your case.
He was somebody who was so well known in his community that he was invited to debates. He debated William Lane Craig, one of the best philosophers on the Christian side.
William Lane Craig is, if you say so.
In his later years, he discovered something evidentially that shifted his thinking. Now, on the basis of the information in DNA, he changed his mind about the existence of God and wrote a book. And it's kind of an interesting cover. It's like, there is no God with the no scratched out, and there is a God written on top of that.
Here's the book, for visual callback for later. I'm going to let Wallace finish for now.
Now, he didn't become a Christian. He simply moved from his atheism to probably a form of deism, the idea that God is necessary for the universe to exist, and even for biology to display signs of design in information in DNA. And that's as far as he went before he died. But he eventually became a theist. Deism is a form of theism.
Well, whether deism is a specialized form of theism, or whether theism is a specialized form of deism, is a topic of much debate.
And he did that on the basis of what? Of evidence. If that form of evidence was good enough for him, given his training, given his stature in the atheist community, given the way in which he was a philosopher as an evidentialist, do you think it might be worthy of your time, of your investigation?
Okay. So before he started this story, Jay let us know that he expected us to investigate it. So let's see how it holds up. At the time, Flew's viewpoints were of such general interest that detailed investigation and documentation began upon first hints of his opinion change. There are a number of lengthy, comprehensive investigative journalism pieces about this still available online, and linked in the description, with the most influential probably the one published by the New York Times. Just like Wallace, I'd encourage you to read them for yourself, but here are some highlights. Around 2004, as Flew was already in his 80s, he became influenced by Gerald Schroeder, an intelligent design proponent whose controversial ideas are roundly criticized by secular and Christian communities alike. Based primarily on the confidence and charisma of Schroeder, Flew began to lean toward the possibility of an Aristotelian god, who had no interaction with the universe but may have kicked things off. Flew continued to reject the notion of a personal God who cares about humans. He never went that far. Quick to come alongside the wavering Flew were well-known resurrection apologist Gary Habermas and religious author Roy Abe Varghese, who seemed eager to use the philosopher as a poster child for conversion. But when pressed, Flew's commitment to the idea seemed to waver. He renounced the science of Schroeder as not up to date, instead deferring to Richard Dawkins, and he revised his introduction to God and philosophy to remove any details about his theistic position, and vowed to further stay out of religious discourse. And yet, the There Is a God book that Wallace referenced hit shelves in 2007, with the author listed as Antony Flew. When the New York Times sat down with Flew to talk about the book, he was repeatedly unfamiliar with the details found in the book. Eventually, Flew conceded that he had not written it. Varghese had. There are lots of other sordid details and accusations to be found. From my perspective, Flew seems like a man who had reached the point in his life where his capacity was at least somewhat diminished, and was disproportionately influenced by whomever the last person to speak to him was. Suffice to say that it is highly questionable to what Flew's views on God actually were, and more importantly, by what methodology he got there. The only thing we can say for sure is that he never capitulated to the Christian God hypothesis.
What I love about Antony Flew's story is that it's on the basis of evidence that he changed his mind, number one.
From the research you wanted me to do, Jay, it seems this is not true at all. His late-in-life God views seem to be informed almost entirely by authorities and those close to him. He never did articulate an evidentiary path to his conclusions.
I think we should be telling his story on occasion, not to suggest that any one expert should be the persuading.
Playing the game of pointing to converts is a bit dangerous. Countless people, including prominent people, have changed religious views in the course of their lives. Catholic to Mormon, Jewish to Muslim, Scientologist to Buddhist, every combination you can imagine. Are you convinced by those? By numbers coming from Pew Research or other studies by Answers in Genesis, young people are leaving Christianity in droves. Should we talk to them? Most atheists you've heard of have had some sort of religiosity they left. Just in the past few months, prominent purity culture Christian author Joshua Harris left his faith, as did Marty Sampson, the famous Hillsong worship artist. On all sides, we could just keep swapping names of converts, which gets us where? Wouldn't this just be some kind of futile appeal to authority? And if this is a good conversational strategy for the Christian to take, why in the world would Antony Flew be the example to hold up? By all appearances, he was an elderly man being manipulated by Christians. And even then, he never actually came around to Christianity. This is the inspirational example you want. Really?
I'm just suggesting that he might know something about evidence and maybe you should take a look too. Not that on the basis of his conversion alone, every one of you guys should convert. I think that's silly, right?
Right.
Now, how are we going to kick this guy to the curb? Well, he's not a biologist. What, do you need biologists who are believers? I got a bunch of those for you.
Yes. If DNA is so compelling to the intelligent design case, why aren't you bringing us geneticist after geneticist who has become a Christian because of their research? That would be much more compelling to me than an aging philosopher who refused to use the internet. Maybe even Francis Collins, head of the Human Genome Project. He became a Christian for entirely different reasons, and affirms biological evolution, and probably disagrees with Wallace on his information assertions. But at least he's a Christian and knows about genetics. Why not him?
And so all I want to do with this example of Antony Flew is not to say, gotcha, told you so. No. It's to say, well, look, this was at least provoked him to look deeper. Do you think it might provoke you to look deeper? You'd be surprised what you might find.
This I can agree with. I looked much deeper into Christianity and was very surprised to find that it didn't support the faith I put into it.
Antony Flew is a good object lesson.
If you think Antony is a good object lesson, then I'd hate to hear what you think are bad examples. There must be some actual Christian you could use.
For the rest of us who might not think that smart people could ever become believers, you'd be surprised. There are a lot of smart people who are believers.
On that we can agree. There are definitely smart people who are believers. I like to think I was one of them. I just didn't know then what I know now. I hope we'd all agree that directly challenging one's own beliefs will help one form more accurate beliefs. As for me, I'll admit you have some evidence, but the evidence I've been presented for the existence of God is highly uncompelling. But please come back when you have more. Thanks for watching. If you'd like to learn more about the reasons I'm not a Christian, tap on this video and I'll see you there. Until next time, later.